Good morning, new schoolers. I'd like to offer up a chess lesson for everybody today. This goes out to our chess club and also the rest of the community in case they might find it useful. It's a good way to pass some time while we're off school, and it's also a great way to keep your brain active and learning. So, today we're going to learn how to play chess. Now, those of you in chess club, I know you know how to play already. However, I'd like you to use this video to teach someone in your family to play so you can keep your skills sharp while we're off school. Now, today I'm going to go over the pieces and the chessboard setup so that we learn what each piece does, how they work, and some terminology, some words that you might need to play the game. Now, first, I want to go over some easy terminology here. Now, of course, the board is made up of black and white squares. Well, on this board, it's actually black and brown, but you get the idea. So now, actually, the rows or the columns of spaces that are lined up going forward towards the opponent, a row of squares in that direction is going to be called a file. Now, a row of squares going side to side across the board is called a rank. Now, the only reason you need to know those for now is so that you understand what I'm talking about. Now, we're going to go on to another term that I'd like to use, and I'll use often, called capturing. And capturing is when you use one of your pieces to take one of your opponent's pieces. And when you capture, you will put your piece in the place where their piece was. You have to land on their space and take it from them. So a pawn who who captures diagonally, as you can see here, they're diagonally across from each other. This pawn would capture by sitting in the space of the opponent's piece, and then we take the opponent's piece off the board and we keep it. Now, I'm going to go through each piece and how it moves. The pawn is the most basic piece. You have 8 of them, and they're all lined up in the second row away from you here. Now, pawns are unique in the way that they move. Actually, every chess piece is unique, but pawn pieces are unique because they only move in one direction. Now, most other pieces can move forward and back. They can move back towards yourself or towards the opponent, but the pawn can only move towards the opponent. It only ever goes across the board towards the opponent. Now, the pawn always moves one space at a time. So every move you have, you and your opponent will take turns taking moves, and white always goes first, just so you know. So always switch off. If you were white last time, let your opponent be white this time. But the pawns move one space at a time, one space per move, across the board, and only in the direction of your opponent. Now, there are 2 exceptions to this rule that I'd like to mention today. The first is that pawns may move 2 spaces if that pawn has not moved yet. It may move 2 spaces its first turn. So my first turn, say as white, could be this, and black's first turn may be to move this. Now, it's not just the first move of the game, but any first move that any of these pawns make. So later in the game, if I want to move this pawn out, it may also move 2 spaces on its first move. Now, there's one other exception to how the pawns move, and that's when they capture. This is the only piece that captures differently than it moves. A pawn only captures diagonally. It cannot capture a piece that's directly in front of it. These are called blocked pawns when they're right up against each other. But if they're diagonal to one another, then this pawn may capture that one if it's his move. Now, if it was black's turn, then they could capture diagonally also. All right. Now, let's move on to the next piece. We're going to go outside of our back row to the inside. Now, one thing I do want to mention as you're setting up your chessboard along the back line here is that queens, the one indicated by the round top rather than the cross top. Here's the cross top, king. The round top, queen. Here, the queen, when you set up, always goes on your color. So the white queen gets set up on the white square. The black queen gets set up on a black square so that they're across from each other. The queens face each other and the kings face each other. I'll give you a better view of that maybe. Now, another important thing to note, because if your board is sideways when you set up, it's not going to be right. The white queen is always on the left of the center line. So, to my left here, oh man, that looks like to the right. So the computer screen is reversed, it turns out. But I want you to remember that the center line, white queen, goes to the left of the center line when you set up. It looks right on the screen here, but that's because my camera is reversed. So now we're going to move on to the backline pieces and how they move, starting from the end and heading towards the center. Now on the edge here we have a rook. It's the one that looks like a castle, and it moves straight along any file or any rank. It can move as far as it wants in one direction at a time, but it may move straight along the rows or columns of spaces. Now, you may not go like this and then turn in the same move. It has to stay on that same line each move. But the rook may move here for one move, and then when it's your next turn, you may move it a different direction as long as it stays along one row or column of spaces. Now, the knight's a little tricky. The knight has some unique qualities also. One thing about it is it's the only piece that can jump over other pieces without touching them or capturing them. Now, of course, all of these pieces, just like the pawns, you have to land on their space, the space that an opponent's in. If the pawn's here, this rook would have to land on that space to capture it. And that's the same for the knight as well. However, the knight moves in an interesting direction. It moves in an L. So if this is where the knight is, it moves 2 spaces and then 1 space, or 1 space and then turns and does 2 spaces. In either order, it can move 2 spaces first and then 1, or 1 space first and then 2. And it can move in any direction with that shape, and that shape sort of makes an L. So it'll go in an L shape with one arm of the L being shorter than the other. Now it can do that whether the L is upside down, backwards, if you're going towards yourself or towards your opponent. No matter what, it can go in an L shape. Now, the knight can capture and move in general by jumping over other pieces. It's the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So if I'm trying to capture this pawn, the knight may make that L shape and jump over this one to capture this pawn here. Okay? And that's true no matter where the knight is on the board. If the pieces you're trying to capture are over here, he may jump and take that piece. Now, even if it's still in its original position back here, it may jump over its own pieces to get to the opponent. Now we're going to move on into the bishop. The bishop is the guy with the frowny face. I don't know. It almost looks like a smile to me sometimes. It's just that he's looking up. Like if this was him, it'd be a smile, right? Yeah. So the bishop here moves kind of like the rook in that it moves in a straight line as far as it wants to. However, while the rook goes along the straight lines of squares, the bishop will actually move diagonally across the same color. Oops, I'm getting off track. Across the same color. So the bishop, whatever square it starts on, like this bishop is starting on the black squares, my other bishop is starting on the white squares. Now for the entire game, they will stay on that same color. They cannot escape their color. So they will travel along only the black squares if they start on the black squares, and only along the white squares if they start on the white squares. Now they capture just the same. If this pawn is over here and I'd like to capture it with my bishop, I just move along the black squares in a straight line to where that opponent's piece is and take it. Now, another thing to note, just like the rook, it cannot turn in the same move. It has to wait until its next move. It would like to turn and move along a new line. So if this is one move, then this is another. So you'll see on the other side of the board, right? On each side we've got a rook, a knight, and a bishop. But in the middle, we've only got one of these each. The queen, as I said before, indicated by the round top. And the king, as I said before, indicated by the cross top. It's got a little cross. This one has a big fat cross, so looks a little different. So the queen moves like a combination of the rook and the bishop. The queen equals the rook and the bishop together, meaning that it can move straight across the ranks, straight across the files, and diagonally, anywhere at once. Now, it doesn't have to stay on one colored square because it may move one space to the side and then it'll be on the white squares, and it can move along those diagonals as well. But remember that the queen can do everything that the rook and bishop can do combined. This makes the queen your best attacking piece. It is the most mobile. It can move as far as it wants across the board in any direction, just like the rook and bishop can move as far across the board as they want, but only in the directions that they're allowed. Across rank or file for the rook, and diagonally for the bishop. Now the king is a special piece. Well, they're all special pieces, but the king is the most important piece because the game ends when your king is trapped. Now that's called checkmate, and I'll go over that in a moment. But for now, I'd like to show you how the king moves, because the king can still capture pieces, and he can still move around the board. The king moves one space at a time, in any direction. It may move towards your opponent or away, just like all the other back line pieces, but it may move in any direction, but only one space at a time. So if this is a move, and then the opponent takes a turn, your next move could be here, and then the opponent takes a turn, and then your next move could be here, but only one space at a time. Now I'm going to go over what check and checkmate are. So one of the earliest ways in a game to get check is if, all right, that's white's first move. Black's first move is to meet him with their pawn. And this doesn't have to be how the game goes. I'm just giving you an example so that I can get quickly to check and checkmate. And describe those to you. Now, say white's second turn might be to move their bishop here. Now black, for consistency's sake, does the same thing. They move their bishop out along that diagonal. Now notice that I had to move the pawn that was blocking that diagonal so that the bishop could get out. The only piece that can jump over the front line, again, is the knights. The bishop, the queen, the rook, the king, none of them can jump over any other pieces. Nor the pawns, but the knight is the only one that can. So I had to move this pawn to get those pieces out. Now, white's third move may be to move their queen here. Okay, I'll show you that from a couple angles so you get a good look. Get that cereal out of the way.
We want the white.
All right, so now say we'll give black a move. Let's say they go here because they want to try and get their bishop out this diagonal coming out towards. Now white could checkmate here, and checkmating is basically when you trap their king and he has nowhere to move. So this is what I'm going to do as white. I'm going to take my queen up here to capture this pawn, which means I take it. And this is actually the fastest checkmate you can get without the opponent doing something totally ridiculous. So right here we see the queen is on that diagonal right next to the opponent's king. This is the opponent's king here, right here. Now, because it captured that pawn, it's right next to the king. So you would think maybe the king could just capture it, right? It can move one space. However, you'll notice that along this diagonal, the bishop is protecting the queen. As it sits over here, it's got a line on its own queen, which means that the king can't move there because then the king would be moving into a line of sight. That's something it can't do. That would be in check. And it cannot do that. Now, it can move, the king could move somewhere else if it had this room to, but it cannot put itself in check, which means putting itself in the line of attack from an opponent's piece. So it cannot move here and place its own king in the line of attack. Now, the king cannot move here or here because he's in the line of attack from the queen. All right, so he can't move right next to the open spaces next to him because he's right next to the queen, and the queen would still have a line of attack on him. So this would be called checkmate, meaning the king is trapped, he's in check, and he has no spaces he can move, no safe spaces that he can move. Now, if this bishop were not here, then it would only merely be check, not checkmate. Because A, he could capture that queen. There's no bishop to protect the queen. And he may go ahead and go there. Now, another thing I'd like to mention is that checkmates can happen from any piece, even a pawn up here could be, or checkmate can happen from any piece. A pawn up here would have the opponent's king in check. He would have to capture it to get out of check. Or, in this case, because the pawn only attacks diagonally, he could move, this is the space that he's in is the only space that's in the pawn's line of attack. So he could move here or here and be out of checkmate. Now, I do encourage you to go to additional resources online if you've got any questions or confusions to clear up any disputes you have while you're playing a game with your family members. Go ahead, buddy. What were you going to say?
But now the king's trapped by his own pieces.
He is. This is how you start at the beginning of the game. He does all the backline pieces start trapped, except for the knight, which may jump over the line if he likes. You have to move those pawns in order to get out. Now, I want to give you a couple hints on how to play a good game of chess. My first hint would be these center four spaces in the board are the most important to control and to protect. These can be kind of considered the intersection of the board. Pretty much any piece attacking towards the king or queen or middle of the board needs to go across there. And any bishops traveling along the longest diagonals of the board have to cross there. So this is a very important section of the board. You want to protect it, defend it, and try and stake a claim on it from as early as possible. How do you do that? Well, your center two pawns are a good place to start. Many people and many professional chess players start their games by getting these center pieces involved. Now, of course, if I move mine straight out here, his pawn is now on a diagonal with one of mine, and he can capture it. However, now my queen is lined up directly in front of that pawn, so he may capture with the queen. Now we've traded pawns, and everybody's pretty much back at square one. So remember to defend these center four squares of the board. The pawns are a great way to do that at the beginning of the game. A lot of first moves are to get those pawns involved. Another good way to do that is after your pawns have moved to get these bishops lined up with those spaces. And of course the knights, when they jump over the line and move to this inside space, they are then aiming at two different center spaces with their L. So the knights are also a great way to protect the center of the board. Now my other piece of advice for a good game of chess, and one that's very competitive and intricate, is to get all of your pieces involved as quickly as possible. It's called piece development. And basically you want to get the pawns that are blocking your pieces moved into the game and out of the way, so that you can get your bishops. Your rooks will generally be the last of your pieces that aren't your queen or king to get involved in the game. But you want to try and get all of them involved, of course with the exception of the king, which is the one that you're trying to protect from getting in check and checkmate. So your king, you're going to try and kind of hide behind some pawns that don't move back here. Now I do like to move the one that's directly in front of the king. However, the one that's diagonal from the king, I try not to move that unless I have a specific plan involved in doing so. That's a good protection pawn. It's probably our most important protection pawn. I'll get into that another time. But know that your king is the one that you're trying to protect. All the others, you'd like to get involved as soon as possible. Now, I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial. Say good morning, Lydian.
Good morning.
Say thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.
Say have fun playing chess.
Have fun playing chess. Wow!
And I want everybody to try and teach a family member today how to play. I appreciate your time, and I hope everybody's doing well out there, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.